The hum of conversation in the premium lounge at JFK Airport was steady, but not loud. It was a place where time seemed to slow down, softened by the glow of pendant lights, the scent of fresh espresso, and the rustle of newspapers. Amid the polished shoes, silk scarves, and tailored suits sat Laura Bennett, a woman whose simple grace contrasted quietly with the extravagance around her. At 42, Laura wore a modest navy blue dress and low heels, not designer, but elegant in its restraint. Her shoulder-length brown hair was neatly pulled back, and her makeup was light. On her wrist was a slim gold watch, a sentimental gift from her husband, Richard Bennett, a self-made billionaire and the majority owner of Sky America Airlines. The timepiece wasn't flashy, but it marked something far more personal: their first meeting, years ago, when Laura was still working as a flight attendant. That day had been ordinary, at least at first. She was pouring coffee in the first-class cabin on a red-eye from Seattle to New York when she noticed a man in seat 3A watching her with warm curiosity, not the usual arrogant smirk she'd grown used to, but a look of genuine interest. He was quiet, unassuming, and kind when they spoke. That man turned out to be Richard. Now, years later, Laura still clung to her independence. Even after marrying one of the wealthiest men in the country, she never adopted the flashy lifestyle. She preferred the small things: weekend hikes in the Adirondacks, working with her hands at the community garden, planning charity events for underprivileged kids in Chicago. Her latest fundraiser had been a huge success, raising over $2 million for youth literacy programs. As a reward, Richard had surprised her with a solo vacation to a coastal wellness resort in California. "You deserve to be pampered," he'd said, wrapping his arms around her that morning. "And I want you to take the flight alone. Relax. You've earned it." He had to attend an emergency meeting in San Francisco and would meet her at the resort later that evening. Laura agreed, reluctantly. First class still made her feel out of place. Now, waiting for boarding, she sipped a glass of chilled lemon water and glanced at the oversized windows overlooking the runway. A Boeing 787 gleamed under the late morning sun, preparing for their non-stop flight to Monterey. Her seat was 2A, first class, window side. She had every right to be there. Still, she felt the subtle stares, quick glances from passengers who assumed she didn't belong. She adjusted her watch, took a slow breath, and stood when the first-class boarding call came through the speakers. Her heels clicked softly against the polished floor as she approached the gate, unaware that the moment she stepped onto the jet bridge, everything was about to change. Laura stepped into the plush first-class cabin, her boarding pass in hand and a hopeful smile on her face. The interior of the Sky America aircraft was immaculate, wide leather seats spaced comfortably apart, warm wood grain accents on the bulkheads, and the gentle clink of champagne flutes as flight attendants moved swiftly through their pre-departure routine. The air smelled faintly of citrus and linen. She barely had a moment to admire the space when a tall woman in a perfectly pressed uniform stepped in front of her. Her name tag read Dana Whitaker, lead flight attendant. Dana's expression was tight and businesslike, but her eyes betrayed something else: disdain. "Ma'am, I believe you may be in the wrong section. First class is reserved for premium ticket holders," Dana said, gesturing toward the back of the plane. Laura blinked in surprise. "I have a first-class ticket," she replied calmly, extending the boarding pass Richard had handed her that morning. Dana took it with just 2 fingers, as though afraid of smudging her manicured nails. She examined the pass as if it were counterfeit, turning it over slowly. Dana muttered. "There must be a mistake. Perhaps you were assigned here in error." Laura could feel eyes on her now. A man in a charcoal gray suit, his gold watch glinting in the overhead lights, looked up from his Wall Street Journal. A woman across the aisle in a designer pantsuit exchanged a look with her husband, then whispered something behind a perfectly manicured hand. Laura recognized the expression, polite amusement laced with judgment. "I'm sure Coach will be more comfortable for you," Dana added with a forced smile. "I'm quite comfortable right here," Laura responded, holding her ground. "My husband purchased this seat for me." That comment prompted a quiet laugh from the woman across the aisle. "Of course he did," she murmured. "Let me guess, he owns the airline?" Dana chuckled softly, clearly enjoying the moment. "Please, ma'am. Just wait here while we resolve the issue." Laura's cheeks flushed, but she didn't waver. She could have said her husband did own the airline. She could have mentioned Richard's name and watched the crew trip over themselves to apologize. But she didn't. She had spent her whole life working hard to be respected for who she was, not for who she married. Still, the embarrassment stung. Her heart pounded in her chest. From behind her, a businessman in his 50s shifted impatiently. "Some of us have places to be," he muttered. Just then, another uniformed man, Frank Delaney, the cabin manager, approached, face taut with tension. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step off the plane momentarily while we sort this out." Laura hesitated. She was being dismissed, judged not by the legitimacy of her ticket but by the simplicity of her dress and the assumptions of strangers. Her fingers brushed the watch on her wrist, grounding her, reminding her of who she was, and of who, exactly, might soon be stepping through that aircraft door. Laura stood frozen in place, the gentle hum of the plane's engines drowned out by the rushing sound in her ears. Around her, whispers flitted like gnats. She heard snippets, "She doesn't belong here, probably trying to sneak in, what's security even doing these days?" The sting wasn't just in Dana's dismissive tone or the manager's cold request, it was in the collective judgment of strangers who didn't know her, who saw a modest dress and assumed she was less important, less worthy, less everything. She glanced down at the boarding pass in her hand. It was legitimate. Her name, Laura Bennett, printed clearly in bold letters. Seat 2A. First class. No error, no mistake. But still, she was being asked to leave. "My ticket is valid," she said softly but firmly. "I have every right to this seat." Frank Delaney, the cabin manager, shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, it's just a matter of verifying some details. I'm sure you understand." No, she didn't understand. Because she'd flown enough flights as a former lead flight attendant to know this wasn't protocol. This was prejudice, plain and simple. Dana's smile had thinned to a tight line. "Security protocols, ma'am. We can't have just anyone sitting in first class without proper verification. Just anyone." The words hung in the air like fog, opaque and cutting. At that moment, Laura felt the heat of humiliation rising in her cheeks. She had been trained to carry herself with dignity, to remain composed even in the face of arrogance. But this was different. This wasn't a rude passenger or a missed meal tray. This was personal. She could sense that Dana relished the subtle power trip, the way some people do when they think no one is watching, or when they believe their target has no one powerful enough to fight back. The woman across the aisle, now openly smirking, adjusted her oversized diamond bracelet. "This is why they need to screen people before they get to the plane," she murmured to her husband. Laura bit the inside of her cheek, her hands clenched tightly around her purse strap. She thought of Richard, probably mid-meeting, unaware of what was happening to his wife, on his own airline. She looked again at the watch on her wrist. Gold-plated with a tiny inscription inside, to the woman who sees the value in everyone. Richard had given it to her on their second anniversary. He said it reminded him not of wealth, but of wisdom, the kind Laura carried without fanfare. The shame she felt began to shift, first into frustration, then into quiet strength. She would not yell. She would not cry. But she also would not be invisible. Just as Frank gestured again toward the jet bridge, a sudden hush fell over the cabin. The aircraft door opened with a firm click. And in stepped a man whose very presence seemed to shift the atmosphere like a thunderclap rolling through a valley. Every sound in the first-class cabin seemed to vanish as the boarding door swung open. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. The rustling of newspapers and the clicking of laptop keys ceased. Even the clink of ice cubes in cocktail glasses paused. Richard Bennett stepped onto the plane. At 6'2", dressed in a custom navy blue suit that subtly bore the mark of high craftsmanship, not flash, but quiet power, he carried himself with the steady confidence of a man who had earned every inch of his success. Silver at his temples gave him a statesmanlike edge, and his sharp blue eyes, usually warm, were now locked onto the scene in front of him with surgical precision. He didn't need to raise his voice. "Laura," he said, his tone low but firm, as he walked down the aisle. "Is there a problem here?" All color drained from Dana's face. Frank visibly stiffened. A ripple of recognition spread like wildfire across the cabin. People turned to look, some with stunned expressions, others with growing unease. The man they just watched Laura being dismissed in front of was the owner of the airline. "Mr. Bennett," Frank stammered. "We were just working to clear up a small seating issue. A simple misunderstanding." "Really," Richard said, stopping beside his wife and placing a protective hand on the small of her back. "That's interesting. Because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like my wife was being questioned, publicly, over a seat that was booked and paid for in her name." Dana tried to regain composure, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sir, we didn't know." "No," Richard cut in, his tone still measured, but with unmistakable weight, "you didn't. You didn't ask. You assumed." His gaze swept over the cabin, pausing briefly on the faces of those who had smirked, whispered, and doubted Laura's place. None of them met his eyes. He turned back to Dana and Frank. "Would you like me to explain who Laura is? Not just my wife, but the former head flight attendant who once handled a mid-air medical emergency with such precision. She saved a man's life before he even realized he was in danger." The cabin was silent. "She was awarded a commendation for it," Richard continued. "It's still displayed at corporate headquarters. Do either of you recall seeing it?" Neither Dana nor Frank responded. Richard stepped slightly forward, but his voice remained even. "This is what happens when judgment comes before service. When uniforms forget their purpose." Then he turned to Laura. "You okay?" She nodded, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly under his touch. "Good," he said, then addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. Please take your seats. My wife and I will be joining you for the remainder of the flight. And yes, her seat is 2A." As he gestured toward her seat, the crowd parted. Laura, once the subject of whispers, now walked with her head high, her husband by her side, and not one person dared question it again. As Richard helped Laura into her seat, 2A, just as her ticket had stated, a visible shift rippled through the first-class cabin. The smug smiles and dismissive glances had vanished, replaced with stiff postures and averted eyes. Even the man in the gray suit who had muttered earlier now seemed very interested in adjusting the time on his Rolex. Richard remained standing for a moment, his broad frame anchoring the space like a monument. Dana had retreated a few paces, her previously confident stance crumbling with each passing second. Frank, the cabin manager, stood to the side, holding his cap like a schoolboy caught misbehaving in church. Richard's tone was calm, but each word struck with the precision of a gavel. Before Laura became my wife, she was the youngest lead flight attendant in Sky America's history. She worked 12-hour flights, double shifts, and once de-escalated a midair passenger conflict that could have turned into a security incident. She earned the respect of her peers, and more importantly, the gratitude of thousands of passengers. He paused, letting the words settle into the heavy silence. She didn't need my name then to command dignity. And she doesn't need it now. The quiet in the cabin was near sacred. Even the background noise from the tarmac outside seemed to fade away. Turning to Frank, Richard added, "As the majority shareholder of Sky America Airlines, I find this situation unacceptable. Effective immediately, every employee, starting with management, will be required to complete new anti-discrimination and customer service training." Frank nodded quickly, sweat beading along his temple. "Yes, sir. Absolutely, Mr. Bennett." Richard then looked directly at Dana. "Miss Whitaker, you'll be the first participant. And your performance will determine whether you remain with the company." Dana opened her mouth to respond but closed it again, her lips trembling. The composure she wore like armor earlier had shattered completely. Laura remained quiet through it all, though her heart swelled. She didn't need Richard to defend her, but it felt deeply meaningful that he had. He wasn't there to flaunt his power, he was there to restore hers. Richard returned to his seat across the aisle, giving Laura a small nod of reassurance. Around them, the other passengers began to settle, though the air remained charged with the aftermath of reckoning. As the aircraft finally began to taxi down the runway, the voice of the pilot came through the speaker, steady and oblivious to the drama that had unfolded moments earlier. "Welcome aboard, ladies and gentlemen. Flight time to Monterey is approximately 5 hours and 20 minutes. Sit back, relax, and enjoy your flight." And with that, the plane lifted off the ground, leaving behind not just the runway, but the prejudice, the embarrassment, and the mistaken assumptions that had tried to take flight alongside Laura. From this altitude, everything looked different. Clearer. Fairer. And the journey had only just begun. The flight climbed smoothly to cruising altitude, but the cabin of Sky America Flight 218 remained cloaked in uneasy silence. The drama had passed, but its aftershocks lingered in the air like distant thunder. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, eyes flickering toward Laura, not with mockery now, but with curiosity, guilt, and in some cases, admiration. The woman who had been snubbed and nearly removed from the flight was now seated in quiet dignity, sipping her sparkling water while looking out at the clouds blanketing the horizon. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Dana Whitaker moved stiffly through the aisle, no longer with the crisp authority she had earlier. Her steps were slower, more careful. Her voice, once sharp and condescending, was now soft and apologetic. She approached Laura hesitantly, holding a small tray. "Mrs. Bennett," she said, barely above a whisper, "would you care for a warm towel or perhaps some fruit?" Laura turned, her expression calm. "I'll take the towel. Thank you." Dana handed it over, her hands slightly shaking. "And I truly am sorry. I didn't realize." Laura met her eyes gently. "That I had a right to be here?" she asked, not unkindly, but directly. Dana didn't answer. She nodded once and turned away. Across the aisle, Richard sat calmly, his laptop open but untouched. He was watching his wife with the same quiet awe he had felt the first day they met. Not because she needed defending, but because she had endured humiliation with more grace than most could muster. After the in-flight service began, Frank, the cabin manager, returned, this time with a bottle of vintage champagne. "Compliments of Sky America," he said, voice steadier than Dana's. "For you and Mr. Bennett." Laura raised a brow but accepted. Richard leaned toward her with a small grin. "Might as well enjoy the perks while we're here." As passengers relaxed into the long-haul flight, the cabin finally began to resemble what it was always meant to be: comfortable, quiet, respectful. Near the rear of first class, the woman in the designer pantsuit who had earlier scoffed at Laura now stared blankly at her in-flight magazine, her diamond bracelet glinting under the cabin lights. The man in the charcoal suit who had earlier muttered about delays now offered Laura a sheepish nod when their eyes met. Change had arrived, not just for Laura, but for everyone on board. But the biggest shift came when Richard turned to Laura and said, casually but meaningfully, "By the way, about that new executive position we've been talking about, the one in customer experience, I think you're the right person for it." Laura blinked. "You mean that's real?" "I thought it was still in discussion." "It was," he replied, "until today." He smiled and raised his glass. "To people who know what respect really means, because they've lived it." Laura lifted her glass and clinked it softly against his. "To new beginnings," she said. The sun was beginning to dip below the Pacific horizon when Laura stepped onto the balcony of their private suite at the Monterey Coast Resort. Waves rolled in steady rhythms below, washing against the shore in a soothing lullaby. The scent of salt water mingled with the faint aroma of grilled seafood from a nearby beachside restaurant. Wrapped in a soft cotton robe, Laura leaned against the railing, a glass of Pinot Grigio in hand. The events of the day, so public, so unexpected, still echoed faintly in her mind. But here, with the golden light warming her skin and the ocean stretching into forever, it all seemed distant. Not forgotten, but transformed. Richard stepped out behind her, 2 wine glasses in hand. "You look like you're somewhere far away." She smiled softly. "Just thinking." He handed her a second glass and stood beside her. The two watched in silence for a moment before Laura spoke again. "You know, I've always tried to walk my own path. Even after we got married. I didn't want to be known as Mrs. Richard Bennett. I wanted to be Laura, who worked her way up, who earned respect without needing your last name." Richard nodded, listening intently. "That's why today stung so much," she continued. "Not because they didn't know who I was, but because they thought it meant I was no one." He gently placed a hand over hers on the railing. "Laura, you've always been someone, long before I met you. What happened today said more about them than it ever could about you." She turned to look at him. "That position you mentioned. Director of Customer Experience. You really meant it?" "I did," he said, with a soft but steady conviction. "It's not a favor. You've lived the customer experience from every angle: flight crew, passenger, advocate. Who better to help change it for the better?" Laura looked down at her watch, the same one he'd given her years ago, back when they were just beginning. The small engraving inside still caught her off guard sometimes. Time is the only luxury that matters. "I want it," she said finally. "Not for the title. Not even for what happened today. I want it because I believe I can make flying better, for people like me, who don't always look like they belong in first class." Richard smiled. "Then it's yours." They clinked glasses, the sound delicate against the hush of the ocean breeze. As twilight painted the sky in hues of lavender and rose, Laura felt something settle in her chest, not pride, not vengeance, but peace. She had stood tall, endured judgment, and walked away stronger. And now, with the support of a husband who saw her clearly, and a future shaped by her own hand, she was ready for the next chapter. Together, they watched the last sliver of sun disappear beyond the water. Tomorrow, a new journey would begin. The following week, Laura walked through the polished glass doors of Sky America's corporate headquarters in downtown Chicago. The morning sun reflected off the building's tall windows, casting long, warm rays across the marble lobby floor. She took a deep breath as the doors slid closed behind her. There had been no grand announcement, no press release, just a quiet email sent to senior staff introducing the airline's new director of customer experience. No one said it out loud, but everyone in the room remembered the story. The woman who had been humiliated in first class was now sitting at the head of the table. Laura didn't come in to seek revenge. That had never been her nature. She came in with a mission, to make sure no one else would ever have to endure what she had. She started by reviewing the company's frontline training protocols, talking with flight crews, listening to passengers, and even riding a few red-eye flights incognito to see how things felt on the ground, or 35,000 feet above it. Word spread quickly. The new director wasn't just another executive with a fancy title. She knew what it was like to carry coffee trays, soothe anxious travelers, and be judged by the clothes on her back. Her policies weren't written from a spreadsheet, they were born of experience. Back at home, Richard watched his wife with pride as she juggled meetings, mentoring sessions, and planning a nationwide customer empathy workshop series. He supported her fully, but never interfered. He knew this was her calling, her lane to lead. One evening, over a quiet dinner on their back porch, Richard asked gently, "Do you ever wish that moment on the plane hadn't happened?" Laura took a sip of iced tea, the summer air carrying the scent of blooming gardenias from their yard. "No," she said. "I wouldn't wish the humiliation on anyone, but I'm grateful for what it revealed. About the system. About me. It reminded me that there's still work to be done." She paused, then added, "And it showed me something else, that sometimes, the doors that seem to close on us are just entrances to something greater." Richard reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm proud of you, Laura. But I always have been. Not because of your title, but because of your strength." A smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Funny thing is, that strength came from being underestimated so many times. You learn to stand taller when people expect you to shrink." As the cicadas hummed in the distance and twilight began to settle over the lawn, Laura felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. Her story wasn't just about defending her place in a seat, it was about claiming her voice in a world that often looks the other way. And now, with every flight she helped shape and every policy she rewrote, she wasn't just flying, she was helping others rise. Because sometimes, the most powerful journeys don't begin on the runway, they begin when you choose to stand your ground. As we move through life, we come to understand that true worth isn't always visible at first glance. It isn't found in expensive clothes, job titles, or public accolades, it's found in character. In grace under pressure. In the quiet resolve to do what's right, even when others doubt us. That's the heart of Laura Bennett's story, and it's a lesson many of us have learned, sometimes the hard way, over the years. In a society that often rushes to judge by appearances, Laura's experience reminds us of the quiet power of holding on to one's dignity. Though humiliated and dismissed, she chose not to lash out or seek revenge. Instead, she held her head high and let her actions, and ultimately her truth, speak for themselves. For those of us in the later chapters of life, this message feels especially relevant. We've seen how easily people can be overlooked or underestimated. Age, simplicity, or humility can cause others to forget the wisdom, value, and strength we carry. But stories like this are a call to reclaim that value, not with anger, but with calm assurance. They also remind us of the importance of advocating for respect, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. Our example, especially to younger generations, teaches that every person deserves to be seen beyond surface-level judgments. That respect should be given freely, not only when someone proves they deserve it. Laura's story also speaks to partnership, the way her husband supported her not by overshadowing her, but by lifting her up. At any age, it's never too late to be reminded that the people who truly love us see our worth, especially when the world forgets. In our own lives, may we carry these lessons forward. May we choose grace over retaliation, dignity over despair, and never forget the deep truth that our value doesn't fade with time, it only deepens. Because in the end, the legacy we leave isn't measured by what we wore or where we sat, but by how we treated others, and how we carried ourselves when it mattered most.